Hey everybody, it's Shaman Sister Sin, and you're listening to the Meditations and More podcast brought to you by BetterHelp.com and LittleShaman.org. That's me, Little Shaman. Today I wanted to talk to you about something that affects virtually all relationships with narcissistic people, and that is something that we could call filling in the gaps. Before we understand what's going on with most narcissistic personalities and how limited the ability to perform as functioning adults or deal with anything really is for so many of them, it can be hard to see these things because so often we are filling in the gaps for them. The gaps in the relationship, the gaps in communication, the gaps in their abilities, just filling in the gaps in general. Most people don't even realize they're doing it at first, but it becomes very noticeable if it stops. It could be that we are having to shoulder more and more of the responsibility in the relationship as time goes on, but it could also be that it becomes more noticeable as time goes on and the relationship does not ever progress into normal bonding or become something more comfortable and concrete. In relationships with narcissistic parents, people eventually notice how much more emotionally mature they are than their parents. You don't just have to fill in the gaps in the beginning of the relationship or in some areas or at some times. You always have to do it. With many narcissistic personalities, the other person or people find that they always have to shoulder the burden of creating interactions or taking responsibilities because waiting on the narcissist results in nothing happening. They don't make conversation. They won't suggest plans or outings. They can't decide on a restaurant or a movie. They refuse to face or take care of things. Or if they do these things, it's completely and totally on their terms with no input required or even allowed from other people at all. Either way, you have to fill in gaps in order to make the relationship appear to be an actual relationship. It isn't just these kinds of things either. We are also often filling in the gaps in other areas too. For example, when they say and do things, we might fill in the gaps regarding their reasons. He was tired, she was drunk, they were upset, or their motive. He was trying to do this, she was trying to do that. We may fill in the gaps regarding their perception as well. They must have known, they had to have seen, surely they understood. This can go on for a long time before we start to see that we are the ones providing virtually all of these things, mostly because we're projecting our own empathy and experience onto the narcissist and using that to interpret their words and behavior. When we stop doing that, or when we are unable to do it any longer because it just doesn't make any sense, we find that we were projecting certainly more empathy and often a lot more understanding of basic concepts, common situations, and human interactions onto them than they really have. When we stop filling in these gaps, their lack of these things and more becomes very, very obvious. It can be hard to stop doing this. Part of how our brains work is to assume things based on what we see and hear. One of these would be the assumption, for example, that if we're looking at what appears to be a normally functioning adult person who understands and feels things the way most people do, we're dealing with a normally functioning adult person who understands and feels things the way most people do. Unfortunately, this is just not always the case, and it may require periodically checking our thinking to be sure that we're not falling under these automatic assumptions or projecting things onto someone when they don't really fit. A small amount of basic projection is necessary for empathy. We have to be able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and imagine how we would feel in their situation. However, projection is not seeing how other people feel. It's seeing how we feel. There is danger in projecting too much, especially when the situation does not fit. Particularly when someone has done something you would not do or have not done, it's probably not a good idea to try to assume why they did it or how they were feeling. We need to remember that everyone is not like us. Everyone you meet has completely different experiences, thoughts, conditioning, beliefs. They have, in many respects, a completely different brain than you do. Even if many of these things would be similar, that doesn't mean they're the same as you, feel the same as you, have the same motives, or would do the same things. It's important to evaluate someone based on how they actually are and how they really behave, not how we are or how we behave. Because we often have similar wounds and experiences to narcissistic personalities, there can be a tendency to assume that we're the same. We're not. And this idea is one of the things that's responsible for people assuming many narcissistic personalities have more insight, empathy, compassion, and ability to function in relationships than they actually do. It's also responsible for the unintentional enabling that is so common in these relationships because people overly identify with the narcissist as a victim. People often project themselves and their experiences onto the narcissist and make concessions for the narcissist's behavior because they're overly identifying with them, which often results in narcissists not being held accountable for their actions or being given endless chances to do the right thing. This is often based in the assumption that the other person's like us. They're going to do the right thing when they can understand that they've been choosing the wrong thing. And all that's needed is to give them enough time to see that. But people do not need endless chances to choose to do the right thing. They will either do it or they won't. If they won't, giving them multiple chances is not going to change anything. They're not choosing to do the right thing either because they don't want to do the right thing or because they can't. Either way, they're not doing it, and in practical terms, it really doesn't matter why. Another way people fill in the gaps in relationships with narcissists is emotionally. Not only do people have to project empathy, compassion, and other things onto their narcissistic partners or family members in order to create the appearance of a relationship, they also generally have to carry the overwhelming majority of the emotional burden, not just of the relationship, but for the narcissists themselves. Because pathologically narcissistic personalities cannot process or hold negative emotions, they must constantly vent them out. This often results in outbursts, tantrums, and abusive behaviors that must be tolerated, explained, or smoothed over. Partners and family members not only find themselves the frequent targets of anger and abuse, they may also find themselves continuously trying to protect the narcissist from facing the natural consequences of their behavior, often because this will result in unpleasant consequences for themselves as well, such as apologizing to the boss of a narcissistic spouse on their spouse's behalf after a tantrum so that the family's not negatively impacted when the narcissist loses their job, or asking a relative for money to pay the rent so that they are not also evicted from the home they share with a narcissist who has failed to pay. There are seemingly endless situations in these relationships where you may need to fill in the gaps in order to enable a narcissist to function even minimally and to create the impression that there actually is a relationship with another human being here. It may not be obvious to you, especially if you've been doing it for years, but it will become very obvious if you stop. If you stop making all the effort, you will likely find there is subsequently no effort being made at all. In many cases, this type of personality makes no effort on their own behalf or in their own lives in any way. It's very much like a child where they simply assume this responsibility belongs to other people, including all of the responsibility for their own emotional regulation. The revelation of how much they've been carrying the entire relationship can be surprising or even shocking for people who might have realized the relationship was unbalanced and one-sided, but did not realize how unbalanced and one-sided it really was. The other person in the relationship is not really a person at all in that respect. They're a shadow with no substance. Or perhaps more accurately, they're a child with no ability to have an adult relationship, and you've been essentially creating and carrying the relationship alone. This can be particularly traumatic to realize about a parent or caregiver. If you want to see how much you're truly doing, stop doing it. Stop filling in the gaps in the relationship and the communication. Stop making all the effort and see what happens. But be careful. Narcissistic people enlist everyone around them to act as the adults in the situation who are required to take responsibility for everything, maintain all the illusions, and manage things so the narcissist can function. They don't usually react very well when people refuse to do this any longer. This doesn't mean you are responsible for their reactions, and it doesn't mean you're required to do any of it, but it does mean that if you choose to stay in the relationship, you're going to have to keep doing it. Otherwise, there's not even the appearance of a relationship. There's just you, trapped in the funhouse alone. I hope that clears a few things up for you. As always, I look forward to your comments, questions, and suggestions, so please keep those coming. I take appointments online, over the phone, via text, via messenger, via email, and through Skype. So if you're interested in speaking with me one-on-one, you can visit littleshaman.org to do that. I teach workshops, clinics, and seminars throughout the year, so if you're interested in seeing what we are running this month, you can visit littleshaman.org to do that. And if you're interested in joining our support group with multiple meetings held throughout the month, you can visit littleshaman.org to do that as well. You've been listening to the Meditations and More podcast brought to you by BetterHelp.com and LittleShaman.org. That's me, Little Shaman. May the Great Spirit bless you. Have a wonderful day.